Can you hear me? That's okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the general meeting this evening to be held jointly with the Marine Management Organisation. I've got introductions and welcomes by the President and the Chair. Unfortunately, the President's on the screen. So when there's no President there, then the latest President stands in his place, which is me. Well, it was actually David, but he's too busy. So I have to remind you of the notice of the fire exits, just follow the route out there. So, and I'm handing over to Andrew now. Andrew, I'm handing over to you now.
Right, lovely. Okay, well, hopefully this will work. Welcome all to the May Institute lecture. It's fantastic to have with us the Northeast Coast branch of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects and the Institute of Marine Engineers, Mining and Technology. I can hear an echo, David. Anyway, so thank you very much again to Emma for being able to make this talk, and it's great that we've managed to get this working online as well. Our previous lecture was held on the 25th of April. That was jointly with the Institute of Corrosion, and that was on recent changes to high voltage porosity testing standards. We had an excellent attendance from mainly the local branch of ICOR and closing remarks by David Bell. So we will take that as a true record of the meeting. Just to let you know, as we're cycling through various professional organisations, last year we had talks from IMMM and IMechE. This year we're having chartership talks from the Geological Society and the Institution of Engineering and Technology. So if you're involved in geotechnical engineering or land remediation or indeed electrical engineering, do please join us online on Thursday the 30th of May to find out how you can become professionally chartered with these organisations, what the process is, and how to keep up your CPD. We also in June have our one-day conference to do with supporting the future of northern semiconductor industries. This is really raising the profile of the fantastic organisations and companies we have in our region, and also to highlight skills within electrical engineering and semiconductor manufacture. There's lots going on. We've got an excellent programme of speakers, so do please check out our website at mininginstitute.org.uk, and it will be on the homepage as well. So it'd be fantastic to if there are more people to sign up to that one as well and come along and hear. But also just to announce, we've had some success, well, not our success necessarily, but Amelia Russell, who is representing our institute in the IMMM Young Persons Lecture Competition. She went all the way to the UK final with her talk on her research on strained semiconductors. So she was dealing with monolayer molybdenum disulfide layers for sensing applications, and her talk, Why Strained Semiconductors Are Like Crinkle Cut Crisps, managed to win the final as well. So many congratulations to Amelia. And she will be talking at our semiconductor conference in June as well, if you'd like to meet her there. Don't forget, if you want to keep up to date with all of our events, do follow us on various social media platforms. If you want to catch up with our lectures, our ever-growing back catalogue of YouTube videos is also online. And of course, the best way to keep up with all of our events, whether they're lectures like the one you're at, or our upcoming conferences, our annual dinner, our CPD events and socials, and any field trips we might be running, the best way to keep up to date is via becoming a member at mininginstitute.org.uk/membership. Plenty of excellent membership benefits on offer, so do go and have a look and check that out. And with that, I shall hand back to Neville Hall for the introduction to Emma's talk. So thank you very much.
Is this mic working? Yes. There's two mics to pick from, and guess what? You always pick the wrong mic. The introduction. The talk tonight will be given by Emma Dowson, and Emma is a Marine Licensing Senior Case Manager at the Marine Management Organisation, MMO, managing the aggregates and cables sector portfolio of licensing casework. Emma joined the Marine Management Organisation in 2017, coming from a teaching background in secondary education. Since joining the MMO, Emma has worked closely with both the aggregates and the subsea cables industries for over 6 years, building positive working relationships with industry stakeholders and enabling sustainable marine development within both sectors.
I can't hear anything my end. I'm not sure when to start, so let me know.
Just hang on a moment. Can you hear me now, Emma?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, I've just introduced you to the assembled audience. So I'll hand over to you straight away, okay?
Great, thank you very much. So hopefully you can see my screen all right. Thank you very much for hosting me virtually this week. I've not been so well, so it's really a privilege to come and speak to you all this evening. My name is Emma Dowson, as it says on the screen. I am a marine licensing senior case manager for the aggregates and cables sector in the marine licensing team at the MMO, which stands for the Marine Management Organisation. And this evening I'm going to be talking about the work of the MMO and focusing on marine licensing itself and specifically on aggregate dredging marine licensing. So this is kind of what I'm going to cover this evening: who we are, what we do, our jurisdiction in English waters, the need for aggregate dredging, the licensing process itself, and then also the post-consent process, because there's quite a lot that goes on after a determination. And then I'll cover some key successes and challenges that we face. So who are the MMO and what do we do? So the MMO, as I said, stands for the Marine Management Organisation, and we are a non-departmental public body. And we were established under the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009. This came into force in 2011, and we actually inherited the work of the Marine and Fisheries Agency, the MFA, which you might have heard of in the past. So we kind of took that work on and it was put into legislation, into the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009, we call MACA for short, and that is what legislation we use to license. In terms of our relation to government, we, as a non-departmental public body, work at an arm's length, I suppose, from government departments, but we are sponsored by and responsible to the Secretary of State for DEFRA. So that's kind of our nearest kind of government party body that we are related to, and that we feed into a lot with our work and our policies, for example. So yeah, as part of our work, I suppose we help to deliver that government 25-year environmental plan, which you might have heard of. And I suppose our sort of remit there is to do with kind of the marine protected areas and protecting maritime heritage as well. So that's how we relate to DEFRA and government. In terms of our specific goals as an organisation, we have a vision for a prosperous future for our seas, coasts and communities. And really, as England's marine manager, I suppose that is our key job, is to protect and develop our seas for future generations. And I've listed some of our goals there on the screen. I won't go through them all, but it's well worth a look on our website if you're interested in finding out more about our sort of long-term 2030 strategic plan goals. In terms of the services then that we deliver to kind of meet these goals, these kind of come into 6 main areas. Now, obviously, this evening I'm going to be speaking primarily about enabling sustainable marine development, which is what marine licensing feeds directly into. But we have 5 other areas that have very specific teams that work on those particular goals and those areas of marine life that really need that work and that attention. So we have sustainable fishing opportunities. So we do work a lot with commercial fisheries across kind of the English waters area. We also work quite closely protecting marine habitats and wildlife. So we have a marine conservation team that links directly into wildlife licensing, for example. We also administer marine support funds. So we have a grants team that work closely with local marine sort of communities to issue those grants. We provide regulatory support and assurance. That's our marine coastal operations team. They are kind of spread around the country and they deal mainly with enforcement and investigations into all sorts of licensing, from fishing to marine licensing, for example. And then we also have our global marine protection team who work with other bodies, government bodies across the world to sort of help them develop their marine policies and sort of give them ideas on how to sort of make their marine development more sustainable as well in other parts of the world. So there's lots of different aspects that the Marine Management Organisation work with. As I said, though, I'll be kind of mainly focusing on enabling sustainable development because that is what marine licensing hopes to and aims to do, to basically license and regulate these marine activities in a way that means they are carried out sustainably. And to do that, I suppose I kind of need to take a step back and sort of talk you through the story a little bit. We have what we call marine plans. They cover all of England's seas and coasts. And we use those in the marine licensing team to help to kind of give us a direction when we are taking a marine licensing decision. So it really does start with the marine plans. It's very plan-led in terms of decision making. And as I put there on the screen, I mean, we support billions worth of marine developments every year through licensing and permitting these developments. And these can range from anything from, a port development to an aggregate license to subsea cabling for telecommunications, for example. So there's lots of different facets of industry that we work with as a company. Just a little bit then on marine plans, and I put a map there on the screen just to give you an idea of the scale of these marine plans. As you can see, they cover a very vast area in English waters. And these really do set out those priorities and, like I said, the directions that each different area might have. They might be slightly different in different areas, for example, and we as the licensing body have to take that into account when making our licensing decisions. So yeah, as I said there, it helps marine users to understand the best locations for their activities as well. And I would really recommend, if you're interested in looking at this more, we've got an application called Explore Marine Plans online. It's an interactive map and it can help applicants to identify those areas that are best for their developments and where certain plans and policies lie. So I would really recommend taking a look at that if you are interested in finding out more. So therefore, in licensing, we're kind of the next step. So this is our kind of vision in licensing: a customer-focused marine regulator who is experienced and champions sustainable development by using partners to deliver evidence-based, proportionate, efficient, and transparent decisions. And we will do this by progressing casework in a timely and professional manner in accordance with our key performance indicator. And we're quite a large team in licensing. We deal with a hell of a lot of casework. I've highlighted there our key performance indicator. That's quite important. We do have what we call a KPI, where we say that 90% of our cases are determined within 13 weeks. That's not always the case. It doesn't always happen, but we do manage to stay on target. And the other things I've highlighted there, that we're customer focused and that we champion sustainable development. So they're kind of the key things that we are pushing for in our marine licensing vision. A little bit more about marine licensing, just to expand on that, as I said kind of previously, we deal with a huge portfolio of work that comes from vastly different industries. So I've put the kind of key ones on there. So my own sector is the aggregates and cables sector, which in itself are two huge industries that I'm kind of managing the portfolio of work for. We then have ports and marinas, which is obviously based more inshore. We have the nuclear power infrastructure sort of sector, dealing with coastal energy and nuclear power. Then, of course, another huge sector and vastly growing as well is the renewable energy sector, which I see that you've already had a previous lecture on. So yeah, that's a vastly increasing sector at the moment, as you can probably imagine. We have our coastal restoration sector, which deals with seaweed farms, shellfish, aquaculture, those sorts of restoration projects. And then we also have our coastal defences that would include like flood defence, for example, those sorts of projects that are done along the coastline. And it's probably just worth mentioning that marine licensing does come with fees and charges. And so there are different fees payable for different types of projects. So your larger, more complex kind of projects will obviously cost more money for the MMO to process. And the applicant pays the MMO the cost of processing and determining any application that they submit. We do that by kind of putting different sizes and types of project into different fee bands to reflect the work that's required to process a license, which I'll be coming on to in a minute. There is quite a lot of work involved, and a lot of assessments need to be done. So that would be included in a fee estimate that would be sent to an applicant for them to accept, and then to us to carry on with that work and produce that license. So that's hopefully kind of a little roundup of sort of the MMO, what we do, and sort of specifically licensing. I'm going to kind of move on now to the jurisdiction of the MMO, or in English waters, and some of the legislation that we deal with as a marine licensing team. So as you can see here from this map, and sort of was sort of alluded to earlier in the presentation, there's a vast amount of space that we are sort of dealing with in this job. English waters, so we're kind of talking about here any area that's submerged at mean high water spring tide up to the exclusive economic zone and the UK kind of sector of that continental shelf, which is out to 200 nautical miles. So you can see on the map the blue areas, that's the inshore area. So that's your mean high water springs out to 12 nautical miles. And then the orange lines depict the offshore area, which is the 12 nautical miles out to the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone. So as we said, it's a wide, vast area, and it's getting increasingly busy, which we'll come on to later in the presentation. This is just another map to sort of show what other devolved powers have sort of jurisdiction in other areas. So obviously the Scottish government have their own fully devolved powers within their waters. Northern Ireland, similarly, the same. And then the Welsh government, National Resources Wales, they also have devolved powers for marine licenses around their coastline. So it's basically all the orange part that we deal with in the marine licensing team. And then coming on to licensable activities, as I mentioned earlier, it was the Marine and Coastal Access Act 2009 that grants us our powers for licensing of marine development. And it's part 4 of that act that we use as part of the legislation that we use every day. And then looking at sort of mean high water springs and sort of where we're looking at in the seabed. It's anything in or over the sea, on or under the seabed, or from the sea or seabed that would be licensed. And by from, I mean from a vehicle, a vessel, something floating, for example. If there's an activity being done from that, then that would also be considered licensable. So that's the area of licensable activities that we're looking at. And specifically in section 66 are listed 13 licensable activities, and then grouped into these 6 main categories that I've included there on the screen. So we have deposit of any substance or object. So for example, putting down rock protection on a submarine cable would be a deposit. Scuttling of any vessel or container, any construction, alteration or improvement of work. So construction often could be, for example, a port construction or you know, a new harbour wall. It would be a kind of a construction activity. Removal of any substance or object is slightly different to dredging, although you could say that dredging is removal, but that there's certain other activities that would fall into the kind of removal of a substance or object. And then obviously dredging, which is what we're looking at primarily today. That's where aggregate dredging would fit in. And then you have incineration as well. So looking more specifically at licensing aggregate dredging, these are the exact legislative sort of points that really underpin the dredging kind of licensing process. And this is what defines dredging as: to carry out any form of dredging within the UK marine licensing area, whether or not involving the removal or any material from the sea or seabed, and this includes using any device to move any material from one part of the sea to another part of the sea. It might be worth noting at this point that before an applicant comes to us in the MMO for a marine licence for aggregate dredging, the Crown Estate actually has quite an important role before we even get involved. As I'm sure you may be aware, the Crown Estate is the owner of the UK seabed, certainly vast amounts of it. And in all cases, extraction of marine aggregates from the seabed must have consent of the landowner. So therefore, they must have consent from the Crown Estate before they even come to us to apply for a marine licence. And the Crown Estate have a really kind of rigorous method of kind of competitive tender rounds. And you know, applicants will put in their sort of requirements for dredging in a certain area, and it will be the Crown Estate who gives them that permission or landowners' consent effectively, and then they can come to us to get the actual licensing consent for doing the activity. So it's just an important thing to note that lots of things happen before they sort of even get to us, I suppose. Just also wanted to note some of the other regulatory framework that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, I've highlighted there the Marine and Coastal Access Act is the kind of primary domestic legislation that we deal with. But there are many other types of legislation that link in with that and are sometimes even completely separate to that, but that we still have to take into consideration and follow. The Planning Act, for example, is to do with development consent orders, which are very large projects, often spanning into the terrestrial area as well as the marine area. And you also have, I'll pick up on the environmental impact assessment. That's a really important one for aggregates, as we'll come on to see later. So there's lots of different regulatory legislation that we're having to deal with. I won't go into everything in too much detail because we'll be here all night. And then some other things that we take into consideration are other policies and plans. So I've already kind of mentioned the marine plans, for example. They're very, very important to us from especially a local point of view in telling us what's in each area and which directions we need to be sort of making our decisions in. However, there's also kind of a more national framework of policy, the Marine Policy Statement, for example, and then there's other kind of subsections of that as well, as I've just kind of listed on there. But effectively, the point I'm trying to make is it's not just one legislation that we're dealing with. There's multiple legislations that we are having to abide by. And if all that wasn't confusing enough, we also have marine licensing exemptions. So there are some activities which are exempt from requiring a marine license. And there's a list, as long as your arm, of some of these exemptions, but there are very specific things that need to be sort of met in order for some things to be exempt. So I've got a few images there on the screen. Kind of the far left is sampling. There's a sampling grabber, which would go down and kind of sample the seabed, bring it up for testing. You are exempt from sampling testing for up to 1 cubic meter. So it's not very much, but if you were doing a small amount of sampling, then you would be exempt from needing a marine license. Also, markers and buoys are exempt. And also the third one along is navigational dredging. So that's basically under 500 cubic meters of navigational dredging would be exempt. And that's kind of could be within a harbour authority, for example, or a smaller port where they have that ability to do that. And the last one, as you can see, removal of marine litter would also be an exempt activity. And so I just thought I'd kind of list some of the other ones just out of interest, in case you're interested in some of those things. Anything related to, for example, the Ministry of Defence, there's an exemption for defence activities, also for firefighting activities. I've highlighted 2 in red on the screen there, and they are kind of most applicable for aggregate dredging, I suppose. So use of scientific instruments. So this is for what we'd call geophysical surveys. So when they're surveying the seabed, they might have an exemption for being able to do that specific survey, as long as they were not having any impact on the environment. And there's a test that we do called a likely significant effect test on any marine protected area. And if they were able to kind of be within those the constraints of that, then they would be allowed to go ahead and survey without a license. And deposits in the course of aggregates. So when an aggregate dredger is dredging, there's overspill, and water is used to sort of kind of make sure that overspill is controlled. That would, if it was happening within that licensed dredge area, then that is also exempt. That's part of sort of what you get licensed effectively. So there's a few things that we have to be aware of when we are licensing these, not just aggregate dredging, but all sorts of other casework. And as you can tell, it can be quite tricky to work out, but as long as you stick to the legislation, normally it makes sense. So I'm going to move on to my third part of the lecture, which is to do with the need for aggregate dredging. It's just a very short section. I just wanted to touch on how important aggregate dredging is for our country, and why, therefore, licensing of this activity is important for the MMO to be involved in. So yeah, just a few facts there that I've taken from the Crown Estate, actually, website. Britain has one of the world's most developed marine aggregate extraction industries, extracting 15 to 20 million tonnes annually. And that's used for a lot of infrastructure construction work across the country. The prediction is that that's going to increase to 29 million tonnes per year by 2030. And I've just sort of included a map there of the kind of key areas around the UK that are, I would say, preferable or favourable for aggregate marine licences. And this is mainly to do with the geology of the seabed in those areas. You can see along the south coast, especially, is a quite popular area for these marine aggregates, and also along the east side of the Anglian region and down into the Thames. So that's kind of where the main areas are. You'll have some outliers in the northwest and the Bristol Channel, for example, but the main sort of areas are around those coastlines. And this just gives you an idea, hopefully, of the volume of aggregate dredge material that is being supplied to different regions and different countries. So these were the 2023 figures. Yeah, and we do, as I say, I have said before, we kind of export quite a substantial quantity of this material as well, out to kind of Belgium, France, etc. So it's definitely an industry that is well established, and therefore the need for licensing is quite clear. So I'm going to move on to sort of the main part, I suppose, of the presentation this evening, which is to do with the licensing process itself, to try and explain to you a little bit about the amount of work that goes into determining a aggregate dredge license. I'm not going to go through everything in this slide. This kind of circular slide is just kind of show the kind of the way that an aggregate dredge license, the kind of cycle of an aggregate dredge license, how it works. There's a lot at each stage, which I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail here. But mainly we've got the pre-application part of the licensing process, then the application itself, where we assess and determine the license. We then move on to the post-consent part of the licensing process, which, as I mentioned, these licenses last for 15 years. So there's quite a lot of monitoring that's done after our determination is made. So that's quite an important part of the process. And then finally, you come to the either renewal of a marine license. So do they want to extend their dredge license for another 15 years, or are they going to relinquish that?
Recording stopped.
Shall I keep going? Yeah, okay. And at each different stage, there's obviously a lot of things going on. I did mention before EIA, which is Environmental Impact Assessments. A lot of pre-app work is done for an environmental impact assessment case. And they are basically all aggregates licenses are automatically screened into EIA. It's another form of legislation which effectively assesses the impact on the environment from that activity, just so that it's clearly and thoroughly looked at before we determine it. And then the application stage, as I said, we have a key performance indicator of 13 weeks. Aggregate licenses do not generally tend to hit that target, as you're probably not surprised to hear. They can often take much longer than that, and that's mainly due to the fact that they are very complex cases, and there's a lot of things to consider when determining a license that will last for 15 years of aggregate dredging in the seabed. So it's an important point to note that these applications are often quite hefty and take a lot of time. I'll come on to the post-consent later on, but hopefully that gives you an idea of the kind of cycle of a marine license for aggregate dredging. This was just to sort of highlight this 13-week sort of blueprint that we have. Now, the ideal marine licensing application would last the 13 weeks, and we have certain points at which we would consult, for example, our primary advisors and the public on an application, and that lasts for a certain amount of time depending on the legislation that you're following. For an aggregate dredge license, for example, we consult for 42 days, whereas a normal marine license would be 28 days. So there's that kind of extra sort of time for an environmental impact assessment case. And when we are licensing, we have to have certain considerations when that are outlined in MACA. Section 69 particularly talks about when determining an application for a marine license, we must have regard to the following things. So the need to protect the environment, need to protect human health, the need to prevent interference with legitimate uses of the sea and other such matters as the authority thinks relevant. So there's quite a lot of things there that we have to balance when we are assessing an application. And that's why a lot of the time these applications are accompanied by a lot of supporting evidence, coastal impact studies, habitats regulations assessments, environmental impact assessments, all sorts, navigational risk assessments. If there's a risk, they will have assessed it, and that will be used as part of our determination of that license. I've just included a few other activities that we might also be considering in tandem with a marine license application. So, for example, are there any fishing, commercial fishing activities going on in that area that they are wanting to dredge in? Is there any recreational boating activities or tourism activities going on in that area? The third picture on the top row is a UXO, or unexploded ordnance. So effectively, from the wars, there are still uncovered bombs that have not exploded yet on the seabed, and you don't want some dredger dredging that up without it being found first. So there's that sort of surveying that needs to be done before we can grant a license in an area if we think there's a risk. Also, as I've mentioned before, renewables is quite a big sector now. It's ever growing, especially with the government's targets for net zero. So we would have to make sure that this wasn't in an area that was, being put aside for renewables activities. The middle bottom picture is reef, a protected reef. So again, habitats, we really need to take into consideration what damage or impact activities can have on nearby habitats, and then of course species as well. So protected species would also be taken into consideration. And that leads me on to my next slide, which is to do with these environmental assessments. It's really key to our decision making, actually. When we are assessing an application and we look at the project and the activity, we have to make sure that we're assessing that impact or pathway of impact to the receptors, the marine receptors that could be impacted. So we think, like I said, species, it could be a fish species, it could be a harbour porpoise, it could be all those sorts of different species. It could also be a habitat. I haven't actually got any on the screen there, but as I said, a reef, protected reef area, for example. So, for example, in this little sort of flow chart, you can see we've got aggregate dredging. We move to what the actual activity or source of the hazard is. So it would be abrasion or removal of habitat, supporting habitat potentially. The hazard then is the noise. What is the impact of that noise on the marine receptors? The pressure is the noise at source. So how does that, is there a pathway effectively from that noise that's being created? And is there exposure to those receptors? And that's effectively a very simplified way of how a habitats regulations assessment is conducted in marine licensing. As I mentioned before, a aggregates dredge license is an EIA license, or what we call an environmental impact assessment. That means it falls under Schedule 2, A2, sorry, of Regulation 10, because Regulation 10 lists extraction of minerals by fluvial or marine dredging as being a Schedule A2 activity. Therefore, it needs additional kind of impact assessment to be undertaken for this type of application. And as I mentioned, the key thing there, or the key difference, is the kind of consulting for 42 days with the general public and key stakeholders. And that brings me on nicely to my next slide, just to sort of outline some of our key stakeholders that we consult with and we get advice from when we are assessing a marine license application. So we have our own MMO internal teams, as I mentioned right back at the start of the presentation. The marine conservation team, for example, we would probably consult with them if we felt that there was any impacts to specific habitats or species. We might also go to our planning team, our marine planning team, who write the marine plans to kind of get a direction on a policy, for example. We then have our technical advisors, CFAS. That stands for the Centre for Environment and Aquaculture Science. So they are our scientific technical advisors, where we get our scientific advice from, and they're the experts. We have several teams within CFAS that we go to. There's a benthic specialist team, a coastal processes specialist team, a fisheries and shell fisheries specialist team, and also an underwater noise specialist team. They're kind of the key ones that we would consult, for example, on a aggregate dredge license. We have other regular consultees as well. I've kind of put a few of the images on the screen there of our key ones. So I mentioned the Crown Estate before, but other people such as the Environment Agency, Natural England, JNCC, kind of key statutory nature conservation bodies that we consult with. In terms of navigation, we definitely go to the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, for example, and Trinity House. From a heritage perspective, our key advisors are Historic England. And then we also will go to kind of local councils, local port authorities. We'll also consult with a local IFCA regarding sort of fisheries impacts. And I did mention before recreational boating, so the Royal Yachting Association as well is a key constituency for us. And then any other interested parties. I'm thinking, for example, the RSPB, potentially, if we found that there was specific pressure on a bird species, we would maybe go to them, and other local wildlife trusts as well. So there's a lot of people that we consult with on these applications, and we take into account everything that's submitted to us when making our decision. Once we have consulted and we feel that we are ready to move to the determination stage of the license, so we feel that we have consulted everyone we need to, we've ironed out any issues that have been raised, then we move on to drafting of the license itself and ultimately any conditions that are put on that license. Section 71 of MACA says that we can either grant a license unconditionally, although I've never seen a license granted unconditionally. We can grant the license subject to conditions, or we can refuse the application. So mainly we would grant the license subject to conditions, although we have refused applications in the past. And we use the mitigation hierarchy there to avoid, reduce, repair, compensate. And in terms of our conditions, we have to be really careful with how they are drafted and what they say, what they're mitigating for. We have what we call the 5 tests. So every condition that's on every license has to meet all of these 5 tests. So the condition must be necessary, it must relate to the activity or development, it must be precise, it must be enforceable, and it must also be reasonable. So we obviously have quite a few standard conditions that fit this and have been used for a very long time. But we also have different types of conditions for aggregate dredging, which I'll come on to now. So the standard license conditions might be things like notifications to mariners to let them know when the activity is commencing. It might also be what vessels the license holder is using. We then have bespoke conditions, which could be brought up during consultation with, for example, Natural England. Say they have noted that there's a pressure on red-throated diver, which I've pictured there on the slide. Then we would work with the applicant and Natural England to draft a condition which is satisfying all parties in order to protect or mitigate any impacts to that particular species, for example. Then we also have, or the aggregates industry anyway, have a kind of pre-drafted set of conditions that have been agreed with consultees, the MMO, and the industry that's used on many marine licenses for aggregate dredging. And we're talking lots of conditions, so around 40 to 45 conditions on one marine license. So there's a lot of compliance sort of involved with an aggregate license. Finally then, just to sort of kind of tidy this section up, conditions obviously secure that mitigation that means that we can then proceed to making a determination. We may well consult with Natural England, JNCC, you know, our advisors on a condition wording, but ultimately it's the responsibility of the MMO to draft that condition and to ensure that meets our 5 tests. And yeah, feedback is provided to consultees, especially if we don't follow their advice. We can make a different decision to what's been advised to us by our consultees, as long as we have a robust sort of evidence-based justification for that decision. And then the draft license is shared with the applicants prior to issue, and then determination is usually made. Finally then, post-consent. So I did mention that an aggregates dredge license lasts for 15 years. And we don't just give them the license and let them go off and kind of dredge for 15 years without any sort of monitoring or mitigation in place. In fact, the post-consent process for aggregate dredging is very very tight and quite well regulated. I wanted to use the image of an iceberg here for just kind of get across the idea of how much work goes into a post-consent into the post-consent monitoring of an aggregate dredge license. So I've got the top of the iceberg as the pre-consent kind of pre-application, application stage, and then underneath the surface is the the huge amount of monitoring that has to be undertaken by the license holder in order to demonstrate their compliance with their marine license. And I've also tucked enforcement in there, which I will touch on, although, as I mentioned at the start, that is mainly our coastal operations team who deal with the enforcement side of things. So some ideas to give you an idea of what sort of surveys and monitoring is done for an aggregate dredge license. There's pre-dredge surveys that are done. This normally is to get an idea of the baseline condition of the seabed. Then there's operational monitoring that's done, and then post-dredge monitoring. If it gets to the end of the license and they want to relinquish the license, then we ask them to demonstrate that they've not impacted that seabed, or that it's within the limits of the impact that were assessed at the application stage. And there's things like bathymetric surveys, vibrocore surveys, drop-down video surveys can be done. Side scan sonar as well is used quite heavily, grab sampling, etc. So there's quite a lot of different types of survey that are used in order to gather the data that's needed to give back to us for monitoring reports that are then assessed by us, normally in consultation with our advisors. Some other kind of compliance annually, they have to report on every single condition and how they've met every single one of the 40 conditions. And we review that annually. So that's 15 years of the license. We also have substantive reviews, which are kind of the big ticket items at the 5th and the 10th year. And that at that point, if we're not happy with the monitoring that's being done or the evidence that's being shown at that point, we could suspend a license or even revoke a license at that point. So they're pretty important as well. Another thing that the aggregates industry are actually very good at is working together. And they've recently, kind of within the last 10 years or so, developed regional monitoring, which gives a really good overview of the context of a region. As I kind of showed on an earlier slide, some of these aggregate areas are quite clumped closely together because of the favourable area of dredging is in, for example, the south coast is a very busy area for aggregate dredging. So I think what the industry have done over time is worked out that they can pool their resources and get a greater sense of what is going on within an area. And as a marine licensing regulator, it's very useful in terms of seeing patterns in a region and how that might then translate into whether or not that's impact caused by dredging, for example, or if it's a natural occurrence that's happening within that region. So yeah, I put some kind of benefits and challenges with this though. Obviously, there's always good and bad to these things. Benefits being consistency and efficiency for the industry. Adaptive management is much easier if you've got more of a regional picture. But some challenges, for example, how does it align with the other monitoring that's already being done? How can you still, or can you still like provide that site-specific data that's actually really still very key to understanding what's happening in that one license area? And yeah, kind of coordinating between the different industry members, who's doing what and where and when. So there's some really good things about it, but also some challenges. So quite a lot of monitoring, as you can imagine, over 15 years of dredging, and that gives us a lot of information about that area as well. So when it comes to renewal time, then obviously that can be used to inform future assessments and help us with our any future determinations that we were to make on that license area. I did say I'd quickly touch on enforcement. So Section 85 of MACA outlines when a breach of a marine licence or condition becomes an offence. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the MMO coastal operations team who have the responsibility for enforcing or taking action on any breaches of marine licences. It's not to say that they don't collaborate with us in licensing. We do provide a lot of evidence to our coastal operations teams who are investigating licenses. And there are a variety of actions that can be taken by the MMO in terms of, punishments, I suppose is the wrong word, but enforcement action. But it does depend on the severity of the breach. And that's certainly not an area of my expertise. So I cannot really give much more than that overview. Finally, another thing just to mention before I come kind of towards the end of my presentation are marine licence variations. So Section 72 of MACA says that the MMO may request to vary a marine licence if we deem that it's necessary. For example, if there's a change in circumstances or in environmental impacts, if we get any different kind of scientific knowledge that we have to take on board. Or any other reason, if there's a safety navigation, for example. If we choose to vary a license, then that's no cost to the operator at all. But if the license holder wishes to vary a license, and much of the time they do, they may want to remove a condition, for example, that doesn't no longer need to be there. They might want to change the end date of their license. They might wish to change one of the methodologies, for example, of their activities. Any of these sorts of things, they would need to submit a variation request to us, and we would have to go through the same process effectively as what we kind of just outlined before, to kind of consult who we need to, and then make a determination on whether we would agree with varying that license or if we would reject that variation request. So once a license is determined, there's lots of things that can happen after that point, as hopefully can be shown from what I've just talked about. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, and I just wanted to give a few kind of key successes and challenges that I personally think we find in this industry in particular. So some key successes are collaboration, I think, with this industry particularly. The aggregates industry are very good at collaborating, not only with ourselves at the MMO, but also the statutory nature conservation bodies and our CFAS technical advisors. We have what's called a RAG group, or Regulatory Advisory Group, and there are regular meetings, and this promotes a really coordinated approach between all of the different kind of bodies that are involved in licensing of this activity. They also undertake quite a lot of strategic work. So recently, most recently, the herring and sand eel methodology was published. That's really key for licensing down the East Coast, especially with the kind of the herring and sand eel spawning areas along that coastline. So they've worked very closely with CFAS, and that's actually going to be used by other industries as well, cabling, renewables, etc. So it's a really kind of a real success for the industry that they work together on those sorts of strategic issues. As I mentioned, regional monitoring is really important as well. And then I suppose consistency. So in terms of licensing, we have over 40 long-term marine licenses currently active for aggregate dredging. And we are still undertaking renewals of some of those. There are also some brand new aggregate dredge areas that have been granted recently and are going through that application process at the moment. And the returns process is such a huge beast to manage, but I do feel like we are now able to process those in quite an improved and a streamlined way with the processes that we have in place. Coming on to challenges then, there's always challenges with everything, but these are some of the key things I thought I'd kind of mention. So capacity within this sector and all marine sectors really, including not just regulators from our point of view, but also advisors that we go to for advice. Capacity is stretched. There's a lot of casework, as I mentioned at the start, that is now being put across our desks, and the process is getting so much more complex with so many more assessments to be done. So yeah, it's a quite tight on capacity, I would say. And that extends to survey contractors as well, because there's just more activity going on in the seabed and in the sea. Survey contractors are busier than ever, from all different sort of industries, kind of pulling them each way, which way, what way, to kind of have their services and use their services. Consultants as well, I would put into that bracket. Another key challenge is marine spatial prioritisation, which sort of fits in with this idea of the seabed just getting busier and busier every year. There's huge spatial squeeze now in our marine area, and it's something that the MMO are very aware of, DEFRA are very aware of, and also I know the Crown Estates are working on sort of programmes to sort of prioritise where landowners' consent is going to go in the next sort of 20 to 30 years. As part of that, in combination and cumulative impacts are getting more and more difficult to assess. You've got a lot of industries trying to kind of cohabit areas, but that spatial squeeze is very difficult to manage sometimes. And with renewables being such a key industry, especially for net gain, that puts pressure on other industries as well. Finally, corporate memory. It's always tricky in sort of a regulator point of view, when people move on from a role or move to a different role, for example, and you lose that corporate memory. So there's the potential for inconsistent advice from advisors, for example, if you get any gaps in service or knowledge, and certainly a risk to delivery of service if that was to continue. So we're working really hard at the MMO to ensure kind of resilience within the licensing team, and to ensure that everyone's kind of trained up on as many industries as possible. Even though we do have obviously set sectors, anyone can work on anything in the licensing team, and that's the idea of trying to build that resilience. So yes, I think that's everything from me. I'm quite aware that I've just sort of talked to a screen for quite a while, but I'm very happy to take questions. So yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Emma. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, thank you. Before we start the question session, I don't think we had apologies. I can't recall that. We have recorded apologies from Keith Hutchinson. Are there any more apologies before we start the question section? I've got John McCabe, who hasn't been very well recently. So if there's no one else, we'll start. So I think that I'm acting as one of the past presidents, Emma. So can I ask the first question?
Yes, of course.
I was quite interested in what you were doing around the English coasts. Then you brought on the screen regarding Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So I was thinking about our dependencies like the Falkland Isles. And the reason I bring that up is because there's been some recent newspaper articles regarding China and Russia interested in the seabed resources around the Falkland Isles. Have you got any connection with that, or have you got any control on that?
No, as far as I'm aware, we don't. I'm trying to think in terms of. I mean, I know we have our global team who work closely with other bodies across in different parts of the world. But I don't. Yeah, I don't think I'm quite aware of us being involved in that area. No.
Okay, thank you. Have we got any questions from the floor before we ask the online questions? Norman Jackson.
Could I just try an experiment so that...
Hello, I'm Norman Jackson from Seton Sluice. One question I would like to ask you is, who funds your organisation, and is there a sort of a balance sheet, and how do you operate?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could somebody maybe repeat that closer to the laptop?
Hi, Emma. Norman asked the question, and how is your organisation funded?
Okay, so in licensing, we're actually self-funded. So the fees and charges that we put out for the applications directly funds the work that we do. So we're kind of self-funding, if that makes sense, in our part of the MMO. I'm not particularly 100% sure how the rest of the MMO is funded. I presume it's through DEFRA, DEFRA government, and the fact that we're an arm's length body from DEFRA. But I know that the marine licensing team, is self-funded through the work that we do directly in licensing.
Thank you, Emma. Next question. Name. Oh, you'll have to come down. Sorry about that. Yeah, come down. We just have to bring people down, Emma. Just hold on a moment.
Right, hello, Erwin Thompson from NEMI. As far as your area is concerned, on the map that you showed at the beginning, how far upstream in rivers do you go?
It's a really good question. So mean high water springs is anything that basically gets wet with the tide. So it's difficult to explain because obviously the Environment Agency has kind of jurisdiction over sort of our rivers and things within England. So yeah, I think we're definitely in the intertidal zone. So anything that then went upstream into kind of a river would be under the Environment Agency's jurisdiction. So yeah, mean high water springs is effectively anything that's kind of wetted within the tide, which is not a kind of clear line. I can understand it. It's quite difficult to explain, but yeah, I hope that sort of answers your question.
Emma, I'll just ask a follow-on question from that is regarding the amount of discharge that the water companies have been putting into the rivers. Have you had any involvement in that whatsoever?
We do not get involved in sort of water quality as such. We consult with Environment Agency on sort of what we'd call a water framework directive assessment. If, for example, a license was quite inshore, then we would have to make sure we knew what kind of the shoreline management plan for that area was and the quality of that water and how that activity might impact upon that water quality. In terms of discharge into kind of rivers and things, that would definitely be sort of an Environment Agency sort of question and issue that they would be dealing with.
Okay, I just thought it was a good follow-on question from what Erwin had said.
Yeah.
I have a question of Gary Hindmarsh. How are underwater power and communication cables protected from damage during new installations?
That's a really good question and one that I can answer because that's my sector as well. So there's a number of different sort of cable protection techniques that are out there. The most sort of popular one, I suppose, is to just bury the cable deep enough that it's not going to be snagged by anything or caught by any fishing gear or anything like that. Obviously, you can imagine, though, that the seabed is not all just nice sand that can be buried under. You have very hard substrates in some areas where you're unable to bury cable. So other cable burial techniques or protection techniques are rock protection, for example. And that could be in the form of rock bags or the kind of concrete mattresses which kind of cover the cable itself. And that would be the same for a cable crossing, for example. If you were putting a cable down and it was crossing another cable, you would need to have protection sort of either side of your new cable as well. There's obviously issues with rock protection. Fishers don't tend to like it. Neither do kind of statutory nature conservation bodies, especially if that rock protection is going down in a marine protected area, for example, and changing the habitat in that area. So there's another level of assessment that's needed if rock protection is something that's required.
Okay, thank you. Just as a supplement to that, I mean, you will know that our third president, Sir George Eliot, was involved in the company that laid the first transatlantic telegraph cable, Emma.
Amazing. That's fantastic. Wow, I did not know that.
Did you not know that? Well,
No.
I thought everybody knew that. Okay, is there any more questions to Emma? We've got a couple more. Okay, there's another one from Gary Hindmarsh. How many new licenses are issued each year, Emma?
Well, that's a very good question. Probably something I should do my homework before turning up today, actually. I can tell you that, like, by the end of a year, we're getting to around sort of 300, 400 applications in a year. That's mainly the only reason I know that is because when each new year starts, we have what's called a marine case management system, and each case is given a unique reference number, and that kind of goes up from 0001 up to 00383 or whatever. So I know that we have a lot of applications. I think I might have to get back to you on sort of our figures from 2023, for example, but I can do that and pass that on.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Are there no more questions? Okay, right, thank you, Emma. Emma, it's my pleasure this evening to give the vote of thanks. I would just like to thank you very much. I came along tonight full of, well, I wonder what it's about sort of thing, and thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I think I speak for everybody here that you actually do know your part, you do know your job, you covered everything very clearly and explicitly. And in fact, there hasn't been that many questions from everybody that's ascended today. And I like the last little thing that you put on the screen. Ambitious for our seas and our coasts, and you've certainly proved that. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to join with me in thanking Emma for giving an excellent presentation this evening. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much for having me.
I think it was said before regarding the next meetings, 6 to 7 p.m. I think it's at this next week, Chartership Information Evening. I think it's on the 30th, is it? 30th, yeah. And 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on the 6th of June, supporting the future of the Northern Semiconductor Industries Conference. So is there anything else? I think it's a while since I've done this, Emma, so you've got to bear with me. I think that's the end of the evening. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming along. And would you please ensure that you've signed the 2 books up there for attendance. And we'll say good night to everyone, and good night to you, Emma, especially you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Bye.
Good night.